our presenters. I want to thank our presenters, of course, Jennifer Burkhart. She serves as our Clallam EDC chair. She also is the Chief HR Officer and the in-house counsel for Olympic Medical Center. She is here today with her partner, Liz. Liz, what is your last name?
Hi, I'm Liz Schwantor. I'm Associate Legal Counsel at OMC. Good morning.
Yes, thank you. And then we have Patty Hanna, who is one of our local business professionals, and she also will be here today as a presenter.
I should have gone to meet people in person.
Say that again?
We need to mute Sally's iPad.
Okay, yes. So for some house cleaning items this morning before we get started, if everyone could please mute or silence your phones for the presentation, and then if you have any of your mics or speakers on, if you could please mute those, that would be great. We provided some wonderful handouts on the table for you, and at the end of each presentation, we want to have a Q&A session. So if you could hold your questions.
Profit corporations. So I've had a really wonderful opportunity to learn from others on this and am very familiar with it, but just a little bit tired. So bear with me as I talk with you this morning about the changes to the Nonprofit Corporations Act. So I think as most of you are familiar, this law took effect on January 1st of this year, 2022. And the prior statute had not been substantially modified since it was first enacted in 1967. So this was long overdue in terms of modernization. And the law did several things in terms of this update. It modernized the former statute and it harmonized the law with the Washington Business Corporations Act. So now the Nonprofit Corporations Act is much more harmonious with the Corporations Act. And it attempted to present rules and procedures in a much more understandable way, which I think it really does at this point in time. It's much more easily understood as we work through, as we will today, a workshop to look at your own bylaws. The new statute contains provisions regarding a few different areas. One is charitable assets, which we'll talk about further, as well as the governing membership rules and the fiduciary duties of the directors. And then we'll also talk a bit about updates to notices and financial provisions as well. The review of this act first started in 2009. So it was more than a decade in the making. And I mention that because it is a very comprehensive update. And so for that reason, we will move through quite a few details. And I'm hopeful that you'll be able to follow along. But I also want you to know that we'll be able to send out some email materials later on, and I'll also be open to questions both at the end of this presentation and also going forward in the future as well. So you'll be provided with contact information. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the structure of the Act. It has four main parts. The first is the formation and general conditions that are set forth in RCW 24.03 subsection A. And the first part consists of those general provisions as well as the filing documents, which we do through the Secretary of State in Washington. It also contains the purposes and the powers and limitations of nonprofit corporations, the gift restrictions, the books and records, as well as the public benefit corporation and foreign corporations. Part 2 of the Act is one of the most important parts, which is the governance provisions. And I say that that's the most important because it is the part that impacts most of us as directors or leaders of nonprofit corporations. And then Part 3 pertains to fundamental transactions, and Part 4 is those actions involving nonprofit corporations. And in addition to Part 2, I would say that Part 4 is also really critical to focus on because of the actions that are involved. This will entail a review of supervision of property that is held for charitable purposes, as well as contested corporate actions. And Liz, are we doing okay on slides? Okay, and we're on Articles of Incorporation? Perfect.
Just let me know when you want to move to the next one.
Absolutely, and thank you so much for your help. So we are on Articles of Incorporation, RCW 24.03A.100. And the Articles of Incorporation have several requirements, as you see set forth on this slide. First of all, we have the name for the nonprofit corporation, fairly standard there, as well as the name and address of the initial registered agent. We have
Jennifer,
yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but does that associate with these?
No, I think those are for the second
Okay.
presentation. I apologize. We are following along with the PowerPoint, and as mentioned, and Colleen, we will send this out after the fact.
Okay.
As reference materials.
Okay, great. Thank you.
My apologies for that. All right. So second, we have the name and address of the corporation's initial registered agent, and then we move on to the purpose for which the corporation is organized. And we'll talk a little bit more about the purpose as we go forward. It's a very important part of this is to identify the purpose and then to ensure that that stays the same throughout the organization's ongoing incorporation or is then changed with the Secretary of State in Washington. The Articles of Incorporation must also set forth the number of directors constituting the initial board of directors, and the names and mailing addresses of those persons who will serve as those initial directors. And this is the really important part. If the corporation will have members, as defined in RCW 23.03A.010, a statement that the corporation will have members. So that's in addition to the board of directors. Many of these nonprofit corporations will have a membership, and that part is governed slightly differently from the board of directors. So that's why that's such a critical component. The Articles of Incorporation must also state the distribution of assets upon dissolution of the organization, as well as the name and the mailing address of each incorporation, and the signature of each initial incorporator. And we'll move on to the second slide on Articles of Incorporation. The articles may set forth several components. So first, a statement that the corporation has no members and the names of any initial members. It may also contain provisions regarding managing the business and regulating the affairs of the corporation. And under the second bullet point there, defining and limiting, regulating the powers of the corporation, its board of directors, and its members. And then third, the characteristics, qualifications, rights, limitations, and obligations attaching to each or any class of members. And there may be multiple classes of members. As I mentioned, there may be directors, there may be members, and there also may be different classes of members, which means that there may be different voting rights, there may be different rights or obligations of those various classes of members. And the Articles of Incorporation may also contain a provision permitting or making obligatory indemnification of any individual made a party to a proceeding because the individual is or was a director against liability incurred in the proceeding, or more simply said, a defense for you or for I as a director or a member of that organization should there be any legal proceeding and we have the need to be indemnified against any liability that may be incurred against the entity. And then finally, any provision required to be exempt from taxation under federal, state, or local law. So most of you know that a nonprofit entity must report to the Secretary of State for Washington State, and the initial report is filed with the Articles of Incorporation or within 120 days of formation. Most of us are well beyond that initial report. However, what is important to note is that there must be also an annual report that is filed, and that's filed every year and includes the registered agent information. Also, the Board of Governors, the mailing and physical addresses. We must report major changes, if any occur, to our entity during that year, and any additional fees. And then with regard to major changes, this is also a very important element that I'd like to draw to your attention. If there are any major changes that occur with your entity during that annual year of reporting, that period, a charitable corporation must report it on the next report. And so this would include amendments of the charitable corporation's articles to include one or more of the purposes of the corporation that might be substantially different from what occurred before. Now, most of our entities don't change or pivot on a dime. However, from time to time there are changes if there is a focus, let's say, in the ecological or biological realm on animals, but now we're going to shift to more geological formations or something of that nature. That would be considered a substantial change. So that's just an example of a shift in focus that would be required to be reported to the Washington State Secretary of State. Absolutely.
Real quick. So I'm a person that loves to take notes as I'm following these, and I was going to go make copies of Jennifer's slides. Can anyone who would like a copy, will you raise your hand? And I will, okay. So, keep your hand up. I don't want to make too many, so I'm going to count here. So, no? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, no. And Josh, okay, 23. Thank you.
Thank you, Colleen.
Also be emailed to us?
Yes, they will be emailed, so you don't, so back to 22?
Yeah.
I'm a person that I memorize and learn by writing, so, and I like to coordinate with the slides, so, and we just so appreciate her doing this. It's something that I didn't think of.
My extreme apologies, though, for not bringing written copies. What I will also say is that when I get really excited about a subject, I talk a little bit quickly. So if you need me to slow down, please just raise your hand and let me know that also, because sometimes with taking notes, it can be hard with a speedster up front. Shall I pause for a moment or just continue? All right, great. So let me continue with the major changes reporting requirement. As discussed, that applies if there's a change in purpose or something about the organization that changes that's very important in the way that it is constructed. If there's an operation of significant program or activity that differs from the initial organization's intent at the time that it was filed with the Articles of Incorporation with the Secretary of State, then that must also be reported. So programs and activities that the charitable corporation has previously operated, if you've stopped doing those and now you are changing and shifting to a different focus, perhaps a fundraiser, some other kind of activity that might be quite different. If the Wanda Fuca Festival Association, for example, the JFFA, decided to suddenly change the way that it celebrated annually or the way that it raised money, then we would need to report that to the Secretary of State on that annual report. And then in addition, programs or activities described in the most recent application for the tax exempt status, because of course the tax exempt status is one of the most important benefits of being a charitable organization. And so making sure that anything that's been filed with the IRS and where the IRS has issued its determination letter that provides that tax exempt status, you would want to make sure and report any of those significant changes so that there is nothing that goes awry with regard to tax exempt status. There are some additional major changes, exceptions to the reporting requirements, including religious organizations and others. And Liz, would you like to chime in with any of those, or shall I just review those? We had been talking about your review.
Sure. So, in regard to the major change exceptions,
Yeah, I don't, you don't mind just coming forward?
Sure.
Thank you.
I've never used a microphone. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm not going to drop it. Okay, so in regard to the major change exceptions, I just want to highlight one thing about the major changes is that it's probably going to be fairly rare that you're reporting major changes. They're talking about something big, so just keep that in the back of your mind. In regard to the exceptions, if you're a religious organization, you're not filing a major change. If you are making that change within the first 3 years, again, you're going to be exempt from that requirement to file the major change with your report. And then if you have some sort of program or activity that is not something that's ongoing, that falls outside of it, maybe as Jennifer mentioned, you're doing a one-time maybe you're putting on a musical show for a fundraiser or something like that, and it's outside of your general purpose, you're not reporting that. I'm going to hand it back to Jennifer now.
Perfect, thank you. And you may find that I reach out to Liz on a few of these slides. There's some that we've been talking about. It turns out they have great cell service in Panama, except when you're in a tropical rainforest or jungle. So we were able to talk through some of these initially and see where we had overlapping areas of expertise. I'll now move on to the bylaws. And as Colleen at the EDC knows, I've spent a good amount of time delving into bylaws recently, and this is really a fun review. So if any of you are interested in help, this is such an exciting opportunity for me to be able to dive into these, and I do mean that. And the review, of course, is of your ultimate code. This is your list of rules, regulations for your entity. It's the governing document other than your articles of incorporation. And this is adopted both for the regulation of your entity as well as for the governance of those. And there have been several updates. So now we're able to look at those updates for the governance of the internal affairs of your organization. And we're able to look at the bylaws and whether or not there's any amendment that is needed. Note that some bylaw amendments may require member approval if the amendments affect the members. One important change that I wanted to bring to your attention is that the notice provisions have altered in the new statute that was adopted on January 1st of this year. Notice is now effective even if delivered by mail. That would be just automatically effective 5 days after deposit in mail, or if there is a return receipt that is received. One of the most important updates is that email is now an opt-out type of transmission. So formerly, members or directors of the board needed to opt in for notices to be delivered by email. Now there is, by contrast, an opt-out provision. So email is fine unless otherwise provided for in your articles or bylaws or as agreed to by the parties. And at that point in time, notices are received even if the recipient is unaware, if there are 2 notices sent by email to that individual, even if they show undeliverable. The law specifically provides that that is sufficient notice. So that's something just to note and to perhaps talk with your directors and any members of your organization, particularly if you have any who are not using email on a regular basis and may wish to opt out. That is something that they would need to do affirmatively. So note that the 2 consecutive non-deliverable notices are considered opting out, and opt-in is no longer required for those email addresses. The notice of member meetings has also changed somewhat significantly. So please note that notice shall be given to the voting members of the date and the time and the place of each meeting with no fewer than 10 days and no more than 60 days before the meeting date. Those are time periods that were not in the initial statute that was amended this year. So the 1967 statute did not have those time periods. The regular meetings are defined as those that are required under the Articles of Incorporation or the Bylaws. There's no description of the purpose that is required for your regular meetings. And notice of the regular meeting, other than the annual meeting, may be made by providing each member with the adopted schedule of regular meetings for the ensuing year in the form of a record at any time after the annual meeting and 10 days before the next succeeding regular meeting, and at any time requested by a member or any other notice prescribed by the bylaws. Now, a different category is those of special meetings. So please note that special meetings may be called by the president, the secretary, or 20% of the directors in office. Another note that I would make for you is that you can change this in your bylaws. So with many of these default provisions, and this is one of them, you can, as the EDC did, for example, include the treasurer as someone who can call a special meeting. So if you have another officer or you have a different percentage of your directors that you would like to designate as those that would be required to come together to determine that a special meeting can be called, you can change that in your bylaws. So many of these provisions, and if you have any questions about specific ones that can be changed from time to time as you look through, you can always let me know that, and I can look it up if I don't know it off the top of my head. Yes?
So just to clarify, these are about member meetings, your entire membership, not
That's
the
right.
board of directors. This whole page is not about that.
Correct. That's
The
correct.
board meetings.
That's right. And thank you so much for that clarification, because one of the complexities in reviewing the EDC bylaws, which I hope it's okay to use
Oh, yeah,
as an
please do.
example, it was quite a fun project that took a little bit of time, and we do have director meetings as well as member meetings, and there's quite a bit of difference. There are so many provisions that relate to one body or one part of the body, being the directors, and then the membership meetings as well. So keeping those straight can be a little bit challenging, and then looking back at RCW 24.03 to determine which of those areas we're talking about and what the specific requirements are can also be a little bit, you have to be meticulous about it. So very good. Yes,
And then we also have executive committee meetings.
exactly.
So is that, anyway, I'll let you.
Yes, and I will say that in our EDC bylaws, thank you so much, Colleen, for bringing that up, because that was a third category. So our executive committee, as defined in our bylaws, has 4 members: the chair, the vice chair, the secretary, and the treasurer. And in that case, you can see why we opted to include the treasurer, who is the 4th member of that, as someone who could call a special meeting. So if there were any financial questions, if there were a financial issue, if there was an emergency, it would probably be the chair or the president, but any one of those members of the executive committee could then call that meeting. And we have specific requirements set forth in our bylaws, and yes, it makes it a little bit more tedious perhaps to review, but very detailed and very carefully worded and written and reviewed in order to make sure that our executive committee is functioning at a high level, that those decisions are then reviewed by the full board and voted upon when needed. And even further, if there are decisions that we want the full membership to vote upon, then we are designating in those bylaws how we'd like that to work and what they must vote upon as well. So we have very, very clear provisions about the authority of the executive director and financial provisions, and then what those approval mechanisms are with those 3 entities: the executive committee, the board of directors, as well as the membership. So your bylaws can be as simple or as complex as you wish, depending on the layers of protection that you wish to have. Great, perfect questions. Thank you so much. Next, we'll talk just a little bit further about the notice of board meetings. This is important because if this is violated, then we have ultimately potentially problems with either decisions that are made or votes that occur. So looking specifically at the regular meetings of the board, those may be held with or without notice. So that's a key point. You don't necessarily have to have notice per this statute unless it is prescribed in your bylaws or otherwise required. So that's, again, something where there are so many areas where you have discretion to amend your bylaws if there's something that you'd like to change. So if you'd like to have sufficient notice in your mind of what is an allotment of reasonableness for your members, then you can prescribe that simply by an amendment. The statute does, however, specify that there must be 48 hours of notice for a special meeting of the board. So that needs to include just the basics there: the date, the time, the place of the meeting, and then the purpose, unless it's otherwise set forth in the bylaws or concerns a removal proceeding. So those are the two exceptions. And typically what is set forth in the bylaws is the annual meeting, and that would be described as one of the types of special meetings that you wouldn't necessarily have to include a description of. And then unless the articles or bylaws provide otherwise, the president, the secretary, or 20% of the directors then in office may call and give or cause to be given notice of meeting of the board. And so that's, as I just mentioned, something that can be changed if you wish, but that's the default. An oral notice of the meetings of the board may be given unless, again, this is up to you and your discretion, and if it is included in the bylaws that oral notice is not permitted, then you wouldn't be able to do so under those circumstances. Let's look at directors specifically. The board of directors is very important for our nonprofit corporations. In a 501c3, public charities must have at least 3 or more directors. Again, this is something that can be changed. So in bylaws that I have reviewed and worked with other groups on, we have opted to have different numbers of directors, but there must be a minimum of 3 per statute. And the qualifications are set forth and enumerated in the statute. You do not necessarily need to be a Washington resident, interestingly. Your bylaws may set forth other requirements. So again, looking back at your discretion, your ability to set forth what you believe is necessary, that may be set forth and explicated in your bylaws. The directors may be under the age of 18, but the number of directors under 18 cannot be more than 3 or 1/3 of the directors, whichever is fewer. There's no proxy of delegates. You cannot vote by ballot, and you can be under 18, but not more than 1/3, as just mentioned. Now, as to the terms, there are 1-year terms unless a different term is set forth in the articles or in the bylaws. So again, using the EDC as an example, we have set forth a different term. I believe it's at 3 years. We have a 3-year term. And then we had a specific discussion as we looked at the bylaws as to whether or not we would allow a limit or establish a limit rather, or allow repeating terms as far as the number of terms to be served. So again, your bylaws will dictate that. There is a default, but you can specify that in your own bylaws. And then per the statute, directors will have the right to inspect and copy the books, the records, and the documents of the corporation at any reasonable time to the extent reasonably related to the performance of that director's duties. So within limits. And I would note that provision that I referred to regarding the minors is a new provision under the Nonprofit Corporations Act. So simply something that didn't occur or didn't exist before. Yes.
So this would be a judgment call, but what if one of your board directors wanted a full copy of your QuickBooks? Is that reasonable?
Is that member or director your treasurer?
No.
So clearly,
Not that this has ever happened. I'm just curious. I mean, it could happen, right?
I'd like to know about that.
Yeah, I do think it is a judgment call, and we'd have to look at the specific circumstances, but you can tell that the statute gives really the parameter of whether it's reasonably related to that director's duties. So looking at what the reason for the inquiry is and what the duties are under your bylaws for those directors, it may be that that is reasonable. If, however, given the time requested, so they would like 5 years of records for those QuickBooks, and they've only been a director for 1 year, and there's clearly no business reason to go beyond 1 year, you could easily limit that, for example. So there'd be lots of ways to look at it depending on those circumstances. And in general, it's important to know that the interpretations under this statute are a little bit more liberal. So in general, we would want to be erring on the side of providing some information. However, that being said, there's an undue hardship type of test. So if it's going to be administratively burdensome for the organization, and particularly if it's a small organization, very few staff, for example, then you might be able to say, that's just really not something that we're able to provide at this time beyond, let's say, a certain number of months.
So what if it was just a member of your organization and not a board member? Would that seem reasonable if they wanted, full copies of your profit and loss, balance sheet, cash flow statements for the last few years. Is that reasonable? And what if they want a detail copy?
Yeah, good question. So the statute does not provide that members have that ability to ask for that information. There might be some other considerations, just depending on what is happening with your organization. If you had actually a vested interest in being transparent from a public relations standpoint, you may wish to provide some degree of information, but you do not have to. The statute doesn't require that. It may also be something that if there is pending litigation, or if, for example, you're a public entity, because some nonprofits are, and as you know, I work for Olympic Medical Center, we're a public agency, so if I received a request like that, I'd also be looking at whether the Public Records Act applied for Public Disclosure Act purposes. So there might be some other things that we would be looking at in those scenarios, Colleen, but I think in general, this particular statute would not require you to produce that.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right. If we can focus for a moment on the director's fiduciary duties under RCW 24.03A, this is subsection 495, and the fiduciary duties of directors are defined by the business judgment rule. And my comment on that for you would be that in general, courts are going to look at the business judgment rule as being one where you will be presumed to have been acting reasonably as long as you're able to describe the reasons that you took a particular action and be able to describe those circumstances. So there is an inherent amount of the exercise of discretion as a director that a court will give you so that you are able to explain those circumstances for any particular decision. And directors may rely, of course, upon any number of factors. So you may rely upon other professionals. So you're looking at your accountants, your legal professionals, others who may provide you with advice and direction. You as a director may also rely on your officers, employees of the organization. So we're looking at the employees who keep track of things on a daily basis and may have far more information than a director who's operating at another level and very busy. So relying on that person and asking for some information is completely reasonable in the eyes of the courts. And then if you have board committees that are established, then you can rely upon those committees. So very often you'll have a small committee that is tasked with research of one particular area or review of the strategic plan, for example, or something of that nature. And you're going to be well positioned if you've relied upon that committee for advice and direction. So each director is, of course, charged with proceeding in good faith and must use good faith in the exercise of those director duties. And the law requires that there's a duty of care that must be utilized by every director. So that's the care of an ordinarily prudent person in a like position and what that person would exercise under similar circumstances. So really we're looking at the reasonable person standard. Back in law school, they used to call it the reasonable man. Now I think it's much more PC to call it the reasonable person standard, but really just at its essence, it's what would the reasonable person do under similarly considered circumstances. And then there is a duty of loyalty, of course. A director must act in a manner that the director reasonably believes to be in the best interest of the nonprofit corporation. So very often as your discussions tend to look at various factors and you're making determinations, coming back to what is in the best interest of this nonprofit corporation under these circumstances at this moment in time is really the North Star for you as a director or as a leader of that organization. And then it's important to know that in discharging board or committee duties, a director must disclose to other board members or committee members information that is not already known to them. So very important to know that if you know that there is information that may be material to the discharge of their decision making or their oversight functions, and it's very important to share that information with them. Note, however, that there are exceptions under the law. So accept that the disclosure is not required to the extent that the director reasonably believes that doing so would violate a duty that is otherwise imposed by law or a legally enforceable obligation of confidentiality or a professional ethics code. And I can give you an example. If there is a non-disclosure agreement and you have signed that as an officer of the organization, you may be unable to share some information that is contained in that agreement with someone on the board, even if it is material. But those types of determinations would be very specifically made under the facts of that circumstance. So it's something that you would want to consider very carefully before making the determination not to share information that could otherwise be material. The next topic is board action without meeting. And this is also a change from the current statute, so important to focus on this for just a moment. That unanimous written consent is required for action without a meeting, but only those directors who are, quote, entitled to vote. So note that interested or conflicted directors may not be entitled to vote, provided that certain criteria are met. And unanimous written consents are not effective until the last director signs. So I want to focus on the first two bullet points for a moment. That's going to be if there is a conflict of interest, you may have someone who chooses to recuse themselves, and that may be necessary for that particular vote, because under those circumstances, they're not entitled to vote. And then note that if we have a unanimous written consent, as noted in the third bullet point there, that would not be effective until the last director actually signs that. And it must be signed by all within 60 days from the date of record, which is the date of the first signature, in order for that to be valid and enforceable. Yeah.
Would email be sufficient? Is that what?
Indeed.
Okay.
Email is considered written notice, and thank you very much for that question, because again, that was not addressed by the previous iteration of the statute adopted in 1967. It is addressed now that email is specifically included. Very good question. And then just to focus for a moment on the conflict of interest provision, because this is important. There are so many opportunities, especially in a small community, for us to be faced with a conflict of interest, or one of our directors or members to face such a conflict. And so it's really key to know with specificity these provisions. A contract is not void or voidable due to a conflict of interest between your corporation, the nonprofit corporation, and a member, a director, or an officer if certain factors are met. So if the board authorizes the transaction by a vote of a majority after disclosure of the material facts as to the relationship or interest and as to the nature of the contract. So if you had a board member, for example, if you had a director who had a financial interest in a particular contract that you may be choosing to consider at a point in time, you would want to ensure that you discuss that. If there's a need to recuse that individual, for them to recuse themselves rather, that would be appropriate. But if the full board is aware and understands that there may be some financial gain or effect on that person, then you can go forward as long as that's been fully disclosed and discussed and agreed to. So under the second bullet point, if the material facts as to the relationship or interest and as to the contract are disclosed and known to the board, and to the board authorized the contract, and the board actually authorized the contract by both of the disinterested directors, then that also would ensure that that contract is not void or voidable. And the contract or transaction must be fair as to the corporation at the time that the board or the member authorizes, approves, or ratifies that. So there will be an independent determination if there's ever a challenge to that particular action as to whether it was fair and reasonable for the organization to proceed in that fashion, as determined by the best interest of the nonprofit entity. And then finally, interested directors may be counted in determining the presence of a quorum at a meeting of the board for purposes of that decision on the contract. Yes?
Okay, on the previous slide on the meeting without, action without a meeting, that can be a vote. It said it's not effective until the last person signs it.
Correct.
If it's a vote, how many of us want to do this or not? Your last person may be holding out because they don't want to. I mean, it doesn't have to be unanimous, does it? And what if you have a board of 10 and the 10th person never responds to the email? Then it's dead. You have to have a real meeting.
It's possible. So the unanimity provision would be determined by your bylaws. So if your bylaws say that unanimous consent is required for that decision, then you may face a situation where someone holds out. And your remedy in that case would be to call an in-person meeting and go ahead and require the membership to come together and make that decision. But you're right, if your bylaws require that, there could be a problem. There are provisions that you can include that you don't necessarily have to have unanimous consent. You could certainly have majority of the board of directors or majority of membership, for example. But you're right, that's a technical difficulty, and one of the reasons that these bylaws become so important. And sometimes you look at these provisions and it's hard to imagine how they might be utilized in practice, but if you had a unanimity provision required, that would be something that could cause problems.
I'm just thinking, if you have some board member that hardly ever checks their email, and you've got 9 board members have all said, yes, let's do this, and this last person's out of town, they're in Panama or something. So, what do you do? I was just concerned about the thing not being effective until the last, what qualifies as the last to respond? Is it the last that would make it a yes vote, a majority?
Does the statute contemplate virtual meetings for these board meetings? And that substitutes for an in-person meeting?
Very well said, thank you. And we do that, of course, with the EDC, so that would be another option, is to have a virtual meeting. So you could call that quote-unquote in-person meeting, but do it by Zoom or some other virtual platform and go forward in that manner. And again, you could also look at amendment of the bylaws if it became a recurring problem. It might be something that would be important to look at that decision-making process. I know that that's something from time to time we've looked at with the EDC, because we want to be able to use to move nimbly rather in some decision-making contexts. And so we want to make sure that those provisions, even though somewhat meticulous and tedious as we look at them in concept, once we're applying them, they actually work for the organization. Yes, Rebecca.
So in essence, can you kind of do a hybrid, so you've got some written consent and the rest in person?
Yes.
Okay.
The statute absolutely contemplates that your bylaws can have some flexibility with regard to that. You just need to look very carefully at your provisions and make sure they make sense and they are in accord with the way that the statute contemplates that structure, but the answer is yes.
I guess I'm wondering, because you said that there are proxies allowed, so that it kind of gets fine in that is that written consent considered a proxy or not? You know what I mean?
Yes, if it's a written vote that's been called, then absolutely the written consent is going to be considered valid, or I wouldn't call it a proxy necessarily, but it would be considered a valid vote. So yes, and then again, a remedy would be to call that in-person meeting. And a lot of times with your boards, as I think most of you are aware, you're able to also just supplement other kinds of conversations. So you can simply give a phone call to the member who's not checking their email. There are quite a few things that you can do from a standpoint of being pragmatic to make sure that you're getting the votes. And then again, your ultimate default remedy is going to be changing your bylaws if it's really not working in terms of the voting mechanism that you have in place.
Jennifer, can you speak to best practice there as regarding changing your bylaws? I know at one point our EDC had in our bylaws that the board could change the bylaws, and then we changed it back to the entire membership could only change your bylaws because the bylaws are intended to be fairly permanent, right? So do you have an opinion on that?
Yes, I'm glad you raised that. So, and I would say it's slightly more nuanced in terms of they're intended to be permanent, the bylaws that is, but they're also intended to work for the board. So being able to look at those and review them from time to time regularly, as we have been with the EDC, it's been a great process because we can look at, from a practical standpoint, if they're working for us. But the flip side of that, of course, is you don't want someone to be able to just change things on a dime or change things in a way that doesn't work for the rest of the organization. So we did, as a best practice, look at being able to get the approval of the full membership as opposed to just the board, which is a smaller group. And certainly actions of the executive committee would not stand unless they're approved by the full board. So we've made sure to go through that tiered process with the EDC and ensure that there is integrity in that process so that we're not simply making decisions frivolously or otherwise. But again, being able to amend them when needed is an important part. So balancing that need for flexibility in addition to some level of permanence is really important. Outstanding. If there are no other questions, we'll go on to officers. The officers are really important under a nonprofit corporation. The statute again has default provisions. So under this act, there should be a president, a secretary, and a treasurer. But as you'll note, as with most of the provisions in the statute, there are ways to change it for your organization in order to tailor it to your needs. So other officers may be authorized by your articles of incorporation or your bylaws, and again, or by the board. And to use the EDC as an example, we have a vice chair. We don't need to have a vice chair, but we do. We have someone who stands in and is able to take on duties as needed for the chair of the executive committee and the board, and that's just something that is prudent and that the organization has deemed they wish to have. Statute doesn't require it, but we have it in our bylaws, so now it is required for us. And then unless the articles or bylaws will provide otherwise, the board would elect or appoint all officers annually. So again, you could have a longer term. In the case of the EDC, it is 3 years, but that's something that your organization can make an individual decision about. And officers should serve until their respective successors have been elected or appointed, or until their earlier removal. And that is something that is stated in terms of process in the statute, how removal works, and there is a process for resignation as well. Note that the same individual may simultaneously hold more than one office in a nonprofit corporation, except that that same individual may not be president and secretary. So you could have someone who serves as president and treasurer, for example, but not president and secretary. And each officer by statute must have the authority and shall perform the duties that are set forth in your articles of incorporation or in the bylaws to the extent consistent with those documents. And the duties that are prescribed by the board or by direction of an officer authorized by the board to prescribe the duties of other officers. So in other words, you can have discussion about what duties specifically the secretary will have, the treasurer will have, the vice chair, and the chair of your organization. Those can be set forth in the bylaws, which is a best practice, but you can also have certain delineated duties that may be a little bit more detailed that are just agreed upon and that you utilize in practice. We talked for a moment earlier about fiduciary duties. This is important enough that I want to revisit this for a moment. This is one of the areas where typically organizations will have indemnity so that you will not be personally liable for some kind of concern that is raised regarding fiduciary duties. However, because this can vary based on circumstances, it's just really important for all of us to have a really deep understanding of what fiduciary duties mean under Washington law. What it essentially means, just at its purest, simplest definition, is that an officer must act in good faith at all times. And that's something that, although it sounds as if it's not defined specifically in that phrase, it's fairly easy to tell, and I think each and every one of you know when you're describing the circumstances to a court or to an adjudicator of a scenario, describing the way that you acted in good faith will entail explaining the circumstances, the what, the who, the when, where, why, and how you acted and reached that decision under those circumstances. You can also reference the duty of care that you would ordinarily expect a prudent person to use in a like position. And as we had talked about earlier, and I'll pause for just a moment as we get the hard copies. Thank you so much, Scott. Really appreciate it. The duty of loyalty is that a director is expected to use if they are looking at the best interest of the corporation. So using that, again, as the guiding principle, what is in the best interest of your nonprofit, and how does that duty of loyalty then play out in that case? There's a duty to convey information to the appropriate person within the nonprofit. So as we talked about, there would be some potential provisions regarding materiality of information, and there's also some exceptions, but just some guiding principles that are very important to know from the standpoint of what duty you have regarding disclosure of information, the information about the affairs of the corporation within the scope of the officer's function and known to the officer to be material. So I'll give you an example. An easy one would be the treasurer. So within the scope of the treasurer's responsibilities would be those financial duties, and to let you know if there's a problem, particularly if there's a serious problem, if there's been a concern, a suspicion of embezzlement, or if there's a concern of the organization not having enough liquidity to continue operating, something like that. You would certainly expect your treasurer to bring that forward. So that's just an example of the scope of duties. And then information regarding actual or probable material violation of law involving the corporation or material breach of duty to the corporation. So, and again, by way of example, if you had some knowledge that there was potentially a violation of law within your organization or something where you were not complying with a particular statute, you would want to make sure that that is brought forward either by someone who is on the board or by yourself if you are the one who has knowledge of that. Colleen, did you have a question? Colleen.
No.
Oh, okay, you were just wanting a hard copy? Okay, good. No further questions.
So we'll wait till the Q&A.
Perfect, thank you so much. And then finally, of course, you may rely on those other individuals, whether it's other officers, it's employees of the organization, or if it's written materials, even that which is in the general public. You know, if you read it in the newspaper, you're certainly allowed to rely on information that is verified, at least to a reasonable extent. And Liz, I just want to ask you, just pause for a moment. Did you want to talk about distributions, or shall I continue with that? Okay, and perfect. We only have 6 minutes left, and I do want to leave some time for questions, so I will probably cover this fairly quickly, and then I will focus on what is the most important from your perspective as far as questions, and I'll be open again by email or discussion for any questions pertaining to your specific articles or bylaws or any specific scenarios that you may have. I'm happy to ask or answer those rather in the future. So under RCW 2403A 155, we have the topic of distributions. And this is a key point, that no distributions, and this is under the new statute, so a marked change, to members, directors, officers, or other persons who may exercise substantial influence over the affairs of the corporation, of property held for charitable purposes, or dividends, or any part of the corporation's assets, incomes, or profits. However, there are delineated exceptions. So those exceptions are if there is to be reasonable compensation for services rendered. So of course that makes perfect sense. If you have services and the reasonable compensation given the fair market value of those, you may also make payment to a member that is another charitable corporation, and for non-charitable corporations to members in accordance with the purposes. So that's the seeking of professional services, for example, or anything that is within reason and contemplated by your bylaws for purposes of advancing the best interest of your entity. And the liability for distributions is covered by that particular statutory provision, rather. So let me spend my last minute or so focusing on members, because members are really important, and the membership meetings are explicated very specifically in the statute. And then I will leave for another day board committees, unless there are specific questions on board committees. So moving to the membership, the members, these are defined, the members are defined by the statute as where the articles have stated that the corporation has members, which is a person that has certain rights under the articles or the bylaws. And these are not as a delegate, but they select or vote for the election of the directors or delegates to vote on at least one type of fundamental transaction. So your membership will be choosing your board of directors, and then those decisions will be made. And again, this is something that, because you are in charge of your bylaws, you can change this. It is by default written this way in the statute. So if it's not specified in your bylaws, this is the way that it will work. So for a corporation that is formed prior to January 1st of this year, the articles which do not state that the corporation has members, a person who is defined as a member in the bylaws and has a right provided in the bylaws, not as a delegate, to select or vote for the election of directors or delegates, to vote on at least one type of the fundamental transaction. So that will be considered a member. And then if we move to the next slide, the articles of incorporation must state that the corporation has members for you to have a membership part of your entity, and that the members have the right to vote for directors. As we talked about earlier, the members do have the right to inspect documents within reason related to the interests of members and any other rights that you determine that you would like to have set forth in your bylaws. So again, a lot of exercise of discretion and judgment there. And charitable corporations cannot require members to provide capital contributions, but may require consideration for admission to membership, but are not required to. So we've talked a little bit about membership meetings, and then in conclusion, I do want to speak just momentarily to committees, and there's quite a bit that's described in the statute, but what I would share with you just as an overarching principle is that with regard to committees, you are able to designate those by authority of the board. You may have advisory committees, you may have task forces, you may have committees that actually make decisions or recommendations back to your board. All of that will be defined in your bylaws, and you will be able to look at the structure that you have defined. If you don't have that presently in your bylaws, that may be something that you wish to look at, because committees, depending on the size of your organization, the function and the scope of your entity, can be really important in developing your goals and then reaching those. So I would note that you have the board committees. You also have advisory committees that do not have the authority to make decisions, but are able to bring back information to your board, and that's a very important part of task forces. I will pause for a moment for questions. I want to summarize just 4 points in conclusion, if that's all right, and then we have another half of our workshop to move on to. But the conclusion, 4 points that I bring to your attention as maybe the most important takeaways. And I'm jumping to page 28 if you have the handout, because we're running a little short on time. Make sure, please, that your electronic notice is allowed without a provision or a requirement to opt in, so that you are able to deliver notices electronically. You will want to be able to do that in this day and age, of course, and that was not something that we had previously permitted under the statute. The next point, which is really important, is the one that we just covered very briefly, which is to review your committee provisions. I cannot emphasize that enough, because depending on the interests and scope of your organization, you may really need committees to be able to fulfill the important work that you have before you. Are your committees compliant with the statute, and are there any changes or details that need to be fleshed out in your bylaws? And then third, if you want to have members, be very clear in your bylaws, so look at that membership provision. That will not automatically be something that applies to your organization unless you have spelled that out in your bylaws. And then finally, as an important point, just make sure that your officers are listed correctly. And the reason that those last two bullet points are so important, I would say, is because of the overall structure, that you want to make sure that if you have an executive committee who's working with your executive director, if you have a board of directors, and if you have a membership area of your entity, you want all of those various areas to be working together in harmony and be able to be effective. You also want to have the rules and regulations that apply to those 4 different potential decision makers to be working very well for your organization, and that's something that you do have the ability to change in your bylaws. So something to take a look at and make sure that you are very happy with and satisfied with the way that those provisions work. And then the last point I would make is feel free to learn as you go along, because that's what we've done in several of the nonprofit boards with which I have the pleasure and honor of serving, is we've learned as we've gone along when we need to be a little bit more nimble with meetings, as we've learned what other officers we might need and other functions we want to fulfill. We've felt free to sit back, talk about those, and then make changes as needed. What questions do you have? Colleen?
First, a statement: the Washington State website is abysmal and next to impossible to work with, and change officers, and they charge you for everything you do, and it's terrible. So I don't know what we can do as a nonprofit community to make that better, but it's horrible.
We can talk to our legislators.
Okay. Sure. So how
And Colleen, will you wait till the mic so people on the Zoom can hear you?
I have to go. You mentioned change of business way back in the beginning. Our original purpose was to build new construction, and now we also do home repairs. is that something that should be changed? I mean, that's a pretty big change. That's something that should be considered to be changed.
I think so. I'm not entirely familiar with how much of a change that is, but just based on your description that you made just now, I would say it probably does qualify. Would you agree, Liz?
Yeah, I think always err on the side of caution, right?
Okay.
So
All right, so let them know. Also, we do not have a membership. Do all nonprofit meetings need to be a public meeting?
No, they do not. They absolutely do not, unless you are a public organization. So there will be some, OMC, for example, would be, we would have certain public notice requirements, but you do not.
Okay. And lastly, under the distributions, our volunteers all qualify for a 20% discount, and our board members are volunteers. Is that considered a distribution if they shop in the Habitat store and they get a 20% discount?
That is entirely lawful. You are permitted to have that type of distribution. So if it qualifies as such, it is entirely within the scope of the statute. So you can offer that discount. Yes, you're welcome.
Okay.
Hi, on the board committees, it says possess delegated authority.
Yes.
So my question is, how much documentation do you have? Like, for example, we have a committee and we've allocated a budget. Does our bylaws have to say they can execute all decisions based on that top level budget?
I think that's a great question. We've worked extensively with that on some of the boards that I currently serve on, and the EDC is an example, and some others that come to mind. And we've tried to really delineate what the function of the finance committee is. So not only giving some degree of authority to the executive director, and you can give, for example, a percentage, you can give a dollar amount, there's certain delineated authority that you can give to that executive director. If you want your finance committee to be able to make recommendations only, you can definitely indicate that. The more standard and probably more best practice approach is to delineate a certain number of decisions. So, for example, providing the budget to the organization as approved by the executive director, perhaps as approved by a broader body. So trying to be as specific as possible. It doesn't necessarily need to be pages and pages of the kinds of decisions that you would expect that finance committee to make, but you certainly want to be somewhat specific. And I don't mean to put you on the spot, Sarah, but we've been working with the finance committee in our Dungeness Valley Health and Wellness Clinic board, and that's something, we're really honored to have Eric Lewis, who's the former CFO of OMC and now CFO of Washington State Hospital Association, on our finance committee. So we try to give that group some degree of authority. What would you say to that in your experience?
Well, we don't have anything, this is something part of our bylaws.
We're going to be working on it.
Thank you. But we do have, or the way we've set it up so that it's just kind of in our heads but nothing in writing yet, is that the finance committee has the ability to recommend to the board, then we have the board approve, and then they reach out and take care of it, is the way we're set up right now unofficially.
And so to your question about because we don't necessarily have that in writing, but that's something that we're working through based on the update that was effective January 1st, and looking at how much confidence and trust we have in our current finance committee, but not necessarily giving them independent decision making, but please make full and comprehensive recommendations to us because we know you're the experts.
So just as an example, and we went through this in detail, what we ended up doing is wrote in the bylaws that it says, quote, increases to the primary accounts within the operating and non-operating expense chart of accounts that exceed 5% or $500 must be approved by the executive committee, and those increases of expenses that exceed the greater of 10% or $10,000 require board approval. So that's, you've got,
initially it had only been 5% amount, but the problem was we'd have bank fees. Bank fees is $50. It increases by 5%, $2.50. That could very easily happen. So, we created a dollar amount and a percentage amount per line item. And when it went to, either the finance committee, executive committee, and then when it had to go to the board. And that was approved by the full membership to make those changes. And also, if anybody, so I don't take credit for these bylaws. It was Jennifer that wrote them and her friend that she called a big favor in from
David
yes.
Lawson. Great
So,
attorney.
and we have those in Word format, so I'm happy to share those with anybody if you'd like those, because they're pretty damn good at this point.
So let's be mindful of time, and we'll take one more question from Wendy over here in the corner.
Hi, Wendy.
Hey Jennifer, just to clarify, board committee delegation does not have to happen in the bylaws. So at a board meeting, we can also, form a committee to bake cupcakes and delegate the authority there too from the board. So, because as you add things to your bylaws, you want to make sure that they're those things that, are going to persist over time in terms of the functioning of the organization. And there are roles for committees to play that the board can delegate that authority through action at a board meeting, correct?
That is correct, and I'm very glad you raised that. One of the things that we've done at OMC with our board to work through that particular complexity that you're describing is we have an amendment to our bylaws that describes the 12 or so board committees that we have that we can change much more easily than the actual bylaws. So, and I may not be using the right word, it's an addendum. It's an addendum, and we change the addendum from time to time. So we have a strategic plan committee, and we have a finance committee and several others, but there's so many, they're so numerous, and we want to, at least in that case, we do want something in writing. You can do them orally. We want to be able to keep track of them because we have so many and what the functions are, but we also want to be able to revisit that from time to time. So there are several ways to do it, including by oral designation. So thank you so much for that. You're absolutely right. And with that, I really want to thank you for your time and attention and all the great questions, your engagement this morning. This has been just a fantastic audience, and I'm thrilled to be here and would love to work on anyone's bylaws. So please let me know if you have any questions. I actually do really, really enjoy this, and I want to leave time for our subsequent workshop presenter. Thank you so much for your time, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Jennifer. So we'll just take a quick couple minutes, let you guys, if you want to get another refreshment, use the lavatories, and then we will have Patty Hannah come up and give her presentation. We are running a little bit over time, so if you have someplace that you need to be, please feel free to excuse yourself, but we will get started here in about 2 minutes. Thank you. I didn't get your guys' names. Okay, yeah.
And Linda Christensen.
Okay, great.
Same.
All right.
Big organizations, corporations.
I want to
Good.
yes, I know you're going back.
Yeah, no, this is great. Yes, we had talked a little bit about that.
I'm gonna have you just go ahead and say what we're gonna do before we introduce Patty.
So, hello again, everyone. I think Peggy was able to drop the slides into the chat from Jennifer's presentation. So you should be able to access those if you are on Zoom with us today. And we want to go around and have everyone introduce yourself. We'll pass the mic around. And what we'd like you to share is your name, what your organization is that you're representing, and then whether you're staff, executive director, board member, etc. So, and we're kind of cutting into Patty's time by doing this, but we'd really like to know who's here, and I think people on Zoom would like to, connect, that face with that organization. I've always known about and wondered about that. So we're gonna go ahead and do that. And we don't have to stop at 10, so we may go long if that's okay with you. If you have to leave early, that's fine. But we wanna give Patty her full due, and she thought it was a good idea to know who was here as well, as did Jennifer. So I'm gonna start right here, and Lori will be on that side, and go ahead and name your organization and your role.
Hello, I'm Terry Wensitz, and I work with two nonprofits. I work with Catholic Community Services Volunteer Service Program, and I'm the program coordinator there, and I've been there for 19 years, and I also work with CCH, which is a care providing company, also nonprofit, so I'm a residential advisor there for 14 years.
Hi, I'm Linda Christensen, and I'm a volunteer in Terry's organization.
I'm Patricia Guthrie. I'm representing KSQM, and I'm a board member.
I'm Sarah Nichols. I'm the executive director of the Swim Free Clinic, Dungeons Valley Health and Wellness Clinic. And I also thought I had my board member hat for OTA on, but I see we have an OTA person on the Zoom, so.
Hi, I'm Tim Martin, a board member of Olympic View Community Foundation. I'm also a financial advisor at Howard Advisors, and we work with several nonprofits in the county.
Hi, I'm Marcia Massey. I'm the Executive Director for the Olympic Peninsula Visitor Bureau.
Good morning. I'm Robert Wade. I'm a member of the Sequim Masonic Scholarship Foundation, and I'm the Director for Investments.
Hi, I'm Barbara Carr with the Kathleen Sutton Fund. We reimburse women for the transportation costs to go get their cancer treatments. We just hired our first employee. So.
I'm Debbie Fuson. I'm the accountant for the Port Angeles Symphony Orchestra. I'm the treasurer for Pennies for Quarters and treasurer for Port Angeles Business Association.
Good morning, I'm Catherine McKinney, and I'm the Program and Communications Director for Clown Mosaic.
Good morning, I'm Wendy Sisk. I'm the CEO of Peninsula Behavioral Health, and I also serve on the executive committee of the Olympic Community of Health, a nonprofit serving the health needs of Clallam, Jefferson, and Kitsap counties.
Hi, I'm Dawn Brown. I'm the CFO at Peninsula Behavioral Health. I also serve on the board for Habitat for Humanity and a new organization called the Pet Emergency Group, trying to get emergency vet care here to the Clallam County.
Hi, Colleen Robinson, CEO with Habitat for Humanity. I am also honored to be an EDC board member and a few other things out there.
Is there a Lavender Festival coming up that you're executive director of? I'm Rebecca Miller. I'm also on the EDC board and on the executive board for Olympic Peninsula Healthy Communities Coalition. And Andrea and I are revising our bylaws, so thank you. This is very timely.
Good morning, I'm Kay Gagnon with Sequim Sunrise Rotary, and I'm also advisor to Habitat for Humanity.
Those of you that are on Zoom, if you could please put your name, title, and what business you represent, that would be wonderful.
Hello, I'm Charla Wright, and I am here representing the SQUIM Dungeness Valley Chamber of Commerce. I also am on the OMC Foundation Board, as well as the National Hospice and Palliative Care Organization for Palliative Care Committee.
Hi, I'm Sheila Everett, Director of the Olympic View Community Foundation, and I also serve on the board of the Olympic Peninsula Community Clinic.
I'm Marsha Robin, and I'm here with the Port Angeles Food Bank, and I have a few other activities I involve with.
I'm Michael Smith. I'm Executive Director of Shipley Center, which is the senior center in Sequim.
Hi, I'm Linda Kepler. I'm the Association Executive for the Port Angeles Association of Realtors.
Good morning, I'm Andra Smith. I'm Executive Director of the SQUIM Food Bank. I also serve on the board of the Collin County EDC, on the Executive Committee of the Olympic Peninsula Healthy Community Coalition that Rebecca so graciously reminded me that we're doing something with bylaws there. And I also am chair of the Washington Food Coalition and one other, but I can't remember, so.
I'm Diana Lopez. I'm a board member with the Port Angeles Food Bank.
And I also represent the Port Angeles Food Bank, and I'm the executive director.
Dane?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Fran Howell.
I'm Emily Dexter, the Executive Director of the Port Angeles Food Bank, and I clearly don't have as much free time as Andrew.
My name is Leonard Anderson. I am the current president of the SQUIM Dungeness Valley Chamber of Commerce.
I'm Peggy Simmons. I'm the operations manager for Column EDC. So I'm going to ask people on Zoom to go ahead and introduce themselves. I'm going to call on each of you so that you can do that because I don't think people here as we were introducing ourselves heard. So Kevin Russell, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Kevin Russell. I'm a life director for the North Peninsula Building Association. I also am a past chairman of the board of the Building Industry Association of Washington and serve on the Bylaws Committee.
Great, thanks. Christy?
Good morning, everyone. I'm Christy Smith. I'm the CEO of United Way of Clallam County.
And Mary?
Hello, everybody. I'm Mary Budke, CEO of Boys and Girls Clubs of the Olympic Peninsula, serving SQUIM in Port Angeles.
Terrific, thank you. Nicolina?
Good morning. I'm Nicolina Miller, Executive Director of Olympic Peninsula Healthy Community Coalition.
Terrific. Erin?
Good morning. I'm Erin Kennedy, Sound Publishing Advertising Director for the region, and also serve as the treasurer for the SQUIM Dungeness Chamber of Commerce. Thank you.
And Shanna?
Hi, good morning. Shauna Bloom. I'm the new controller with the Peninsula Behavioral Health.
Okay, and Marissa?
Good morning, I'm Marissa Collar-Williams. I'm the Executive Director at Olympic Nature Experience.
Terrific, thank you. David?
Hey, I'm David Herblin. I'm with Olympic Theater Arts. Good to see you.
Great, thanks for joining us. Catherine?
I am Catherine Occhio Grosso. I'm the board president of the Port Angeles Fine Arts Center and have been on the board for several years and had many positions as an officer.
Thank you, Catherine. Sally?
We're going to find out if people walked away from their Zoom.
Hi, my name is Sally Rogers. I'm fairly new to the community. I am a volunteer at the Dungeness Valley Health and Wellness Clinic, and I am now president of the new pet emergency group that Dawn sort of introduced earlier.
Terrific.
Nice to be here.
Thanks for joining us. Carmen?
Hey, good morning. Carmen Geyer here. I'm here on behalf, I serve on the boards for the Port Angeles Chamber of Commerce, the Port Angeles Marathon Association, and the Olympic Peninsula chapter of the Surfrider Foundation.
You're a busy lady. Jessica?
Hi,
Morning,
Jessica.
everyone.
Oh, sorry, there's two Jessicas.
Oh, yeah. Either one. Jessica Compton.
Hi, Jessica Compton, Shore Aquatic and Community Center, also representing Friends of the Pool.
Terrific. Jessica Elliott.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Jessica Elliott, and I'm the Executive Director of the SQUIM Education Foundation.
Okay, terrific. Kyle.
Hello, my name is Kyle Omer, and I am the Executive Director of the Wanda Fuca Foundation.
Okay, and I bet this is not Eshwantwar. Oh, okay. Okay, wonderful. So I think we got Stephen Burke. Oh yeah, that guy, I know him. And we're not talking port issues. Well, Steve Burke.
Steve had to step away. This is Jessica.
He got busted. Okay, so.
Sorry.
Steve, my buddy, is the executive director of the Shore Aquatic Center and also a port commissioner, but there's not a conflict with OPMA.
So that was wonderful to hear all of the different entities that we have represented today in these training sessions. And so with further ado, I want to introduce Patty Hanna. She comes with a lot of experience, and she also served the United Way, correct? I'm sure she's going to share a little bit about herself. The handouts on the table will be Patty's presentation. So go ahead, take it away, Patty.
All right, thank you. And do we have these do the people on Zoom have these? Or can we, okay, can we put them into the chat, drop them in there so they can follow along? You've got copies?
I'll send them to you.
Okay.
Somebody can do that.
Yeah, we'll take care of that. Yeah. We will put them in the chat in just a moment.
All right. Okay, thank you. Thanks for letting me come and do this presentation. Some of you have heard it. I did it not too long ago for the SQUIM Chamber of Commerce, so they have had this. So let's be a little bit of a refresher. And thank you, Jennifer, for the work that you did before. So I don't really need a full hour because some of the stuff that she covered, I covered. But I would give you a little caveat before we even start, is that the RCWs that are cited in this handout are the old RCWs. So one of your first jobs will be to go through and take her presentation and change it. Try to go to the Secretary of State's website and look up these things, and they're really sort of impossible. So, and you know, the final thing for me is a lot of it is common sense. It doesn't matter, do you know it's RCW 35.03.437? I mean, you know, you need to know what your job is. And no matter what the RCW says in here, none of the RCWs that are listed in here are in conflict with the new ones that were presented today. So a lot of you know me. I'm Patty Hanna. I was the executive director of United Way for 25 years, and in that role, worked with a board of directors, a big board. You know, when I started with United Way, there were 36 people on the board of directors. It was a huge board, but it needed to be that big of a board to represent the whole county because it's a big area and the lots of different areas of expertise and influence. So when I became the director of United Way, I didn't know anything about. I've been on boards since I was 16 years old, and I loved being on a board of director. But I really didn't know anything. I only knew from my experience from being on boards. So the first thing that I did was call United Way of King County, the big, you know, the god of all United Ways in Washington, and asked them to come over and do a presentation. So we did a full day presentation. She said, well, what questions do you have? And I said, I don't even know enough to ask any questions. You can just come and talk to us and tell us what we need to know. So the whole board came and we spent a whole day learning how to be board members. And I learned how to be an executive director because that was a new role. I'd not been an executive director before. I'd owned a small business. I taught school. I worked at a radio station. So I worked at KOMP, you know, that rotating group of people that work at KOMP, at least in the olden days. But I really didn't know how to be an executive director. But what I did know how to do was to be a mom with kids, and I know that if you want to get anything done, you better have some cooperation, and it didn't work to be top down, tell them what to do. And I figured that running a board of directors, or working with a board of directors, that was my mindset. Oh, I'm going to run this board of directors. Well, that was the first thing that I had to disabuse myself from, because the executive director does not run the board of directors. The most important thing, and I can tell in here, very few advisory boards, I've been on advisory boards, I really like policy-making boards here, and everybody here, most of you have dual roles. You're executive directors or CEOs or, chief something, and you're also on a board of directors. So that's two different kinds of jobs that you are all performing. So my presentation is really geared to the board side of your lives, but it does carry over to how you behave as an executive director. So you have to think about the board of directors' role is to manage and run the organization. It's like running a small business. Like, I've got a small business, this is what I'm going to do, only you're doing it with a team of people. You're doing it with a team of people, not just you yourself making all the decisions. And people come on to boards of directors with all kinds of agendas. And we saw it a lot with United Way, where people would get in because they didn't like a certain organization or they loved a certain organization and they wanted to make sure that organization got in and stuff. So we had all different kinds of opinions about what it is. But the bottom line is that the policymaking board is the ultimate responsible governing body of the organization. If the organization gets into trouble, whether financially or personnel-wise or anything, it's not the executive director. It's the board that takes the responsibility. And you do have, I want to make sure always that you have directors and officers insurance. And we'll talk about that in managing the risk. But that does not mean that you can just do whatever you want willy-nilly and that insurance, oh, hey, what the heck, I've got insurance. Doesn't really work like that, because insurance's job is not to pay out any money. So you have to take this job as a board member seriously. You have to think of it as running the business. You're going to make the policies, you're going to make the decisions. You're going to employ and evaluate the executive director or the the executive director. So, they used to be called executive secretaries. Then they were called executive directors. And then they were called chief operating officers. And then they were called CEOs. And it doesn't really matter. It's the paid person who's employed by the board of directors. But the board of directors doesn't really employ anybody else. You delegate that responsibility to the director so I'm always going to call the executive director. So you delegate that responsibility for more staff to your executive director. But it's a partnership. So it's a partnership where you might say the executive director would come to you as the board and say, we need another person to help with fundraising or to help, our finances are getting too complex, I don't really understand them, I can't do them, the agency has grown, we need another person. Well, then it's the board of directors' role to make sure you have the money, that you have the space, to help delineate what that job description is going to look like. What exactly is that person going to do? How much can you afford to pay them? How many hours can they work? It's a partnership. You do that stuff all together. Now, my personal philosophy is to really keep the board engaged. So as a board member, you may have been recruited to be on a board the way I was recruited to be on one board. Oh, come on to the board. It's really easy. We have lunch once a month, and there's really not a lot you have to do because the executive director does everything. Well, who doesn't want to be on that board? Well, I tell you, you don't want to be on that board because that board is not really doing their job.
So Patty, I want to make sure we've got the right one up on the screen. Are you going through this one?
Yeah, I'm kind of going through it.
Okay.
I'm on page 2 now.
Okay, good.
Okay, so I'll sort of flag you when I'm going to turn my
Okay,
page.
thank you.
I was looking at the screen and I wasn't looking at the screen. So you're not there just to have lunch once a month or a dinner meeting. You're there to have the responsibility for planning, human resource, all these things that are listed. Financial stability, financial management, the things I really want to talk about a lot are financial management, financial stability, and managing the risk. You want your community relations. You don't just say to the executive director or, you know, do us up some pamphlets, give us a website, put us on Facebook, and then turn your back on it. You want to make sure that all of your community relations, however it is out there, is positive and that it's accurate. That's accurate, that it truly reflects what it is you're doing and how you're doing it. I'll just tell you something that I grew up in a family that was very dysfunctional, and there were a lot of secrets in that family. And then I got married to a man who was pretty dysfunctional because that felt comfortable to me. And then finally, I went to work for United Way, and we visited all these agencies, and it was like 2 years of therapy. And then I got divorced. And so then when I got divorced, I said, there are no secrets. I'm not having any more of those secrets. And I took that philosophy with me to the United Way when I became the director. And I said, we are not having secrets. You can have confidentiality. You can go into executive sessions and things are private. But you have to remember, almost every single one of your nonprofits, you are not working with your money. You're working with somebody else's money. They have given you that money, trusting that you are going to do what you say you are going to do with it. That has to be foremost in your mind all the time. And so I believe that everything needs to be open and above board. You file with the Secretary of State, you're automatically public because they can list. You can go to the Secretary of State website and find the board of directors and the financial statements and all of your information from your agency. That's their job. So I always believed that all of our meetings were open. Anybody could come to a meeting. They don't necessarily vote. They don't necessarily get to have a say as to what you're doing, but they were welcome because it wasn't my money that I was spending out in the community. And I want to make sure that I'm spending the money the way the people that gave us the money wanted it to be spent. So sometimes there's a conflict and a board of directors has to make a decision. Are you going to be the vanguard or the forefront kind of your community? You're going to show the community where they need to go. Or are you going to be a reflection of your community? Are you going to be a reflection of the values of your community and where you are? Or are you going to be somewhere in the middle? You're going to be a reflection of your community the way it is, moving very slowly in small bites, digestible bites, into a direction that the board of directors, that you as a member of the board of directors, thinks that would be a better solution to maybe the problems that you have in your community. And that's a board decision. That's not, oh gosh, I always remember the EDC director who came to Collin County from Maryland. Do you remember that woman? And she came and she went to like her first meetings and she said, well, we need to do this and this and this and this. You know, that waterfront is terrible. We got to do something about that. And where I came from in Maryland, it's going to look like this and we're going to build this. And you know, the community wasn't ready for that. And they didn't like it, and she was not very well received, and she didn't stay very long. But, you know, I learned that you, not like Colleen. Colleen is like here. She's one of us. But moves the EDC. I mean, the EDC did not look anything like the EDC used to look. And if you've been around for 50 years like I have been, you remember what the EDC used to look like. So you don't want to be a complete reflection because then there's no movement. But you don't want to be at the other end. And so you as the board of directors have to make those decisions. And that's the planning and visioning that you do. So change my page here. So Jennifer talked about addendums to your board of directors. What I prefer is a policy manual. A policy, you know, that states this is our principle, this is our framework of action, this is how we're going to do it. You can then, but it has to be voted on by the board of directors. So when I came to United Way, there were no policies. So I was telling my husband, we used to just give our money out, and we gave the money out. We never reported to the public where the money was spent. Nobody knew what the agencies got or what the rest of their budgets looked like. And if anybody asked, we'd say, oh, well, we just figure it out. But we really did. That's not a very good way to treat somebody else's money. And so we developed some policies around funding, around membership requirements, about grant writing, who could get money and what would be the requirements. Because for United Way, people gave us some money. We said, we are going to safeguard your money and make sure that it's spent for the betterment of the community. And that was our philosophy, and that was our guiding philosophy. So when you make decisions, you're going to go back to your philosophy and say, how does this fit in with what we're already doing? Or do we want to change it and then redo our bylaws, for example? But you want to write those policies out, and then you don't have to go through the problem of revising your bylaws and then re-registering them with the state and all of that. You can change your policies on how you do things. So how many committees you have. I'm currently only on one board of directors now. It's the Friends of the Library, which, like, whoever heard of the Friends of the Library, what do they do? Well, Marcia, some of you know. But, you know, the Friends of the Library has a big endowment, like a few $1 million. And we are charged with giving that money back to the library. But we also have our little store in Port Angeles, and then the Sequim Friends of the Library has their own book sales, and they give that money. The Port Angeles store gives over $20,000 back to the library every year, which is a lot of money when you consider that books there cost 25 cents, 5 for $1, 20 cents. So we had to make some policies around how that money is going to be used, what we're going to do. We have very few policies at the Friends of the Library. So it's fun to be on a board that's engaged and active and really working on all of that stuff. So I like policy manuals, and then I like to go back and review those policies. So one of our policies at the Friends of the Library was in our bylaws that we have an executive committee, and I've been on the board for 2 years, and 2.5 years now, and the executive committee had never met. So I brought it up and said, well, what is the executive committee? What are we doing? So we started talking about it and realized, you know, we really should be doing that instead of trying to come to a board meeting and then do all of our business, all of the planning of what the board agenda is going to look like at the board meeting. So that's not very efficient, and that's a waste of people's time. And then they get frustrated and they leave the board. So you want to have some efficiency in how you're running your board of directors. So anyway, I like policy manuals, what you want to accomplish, how you want to do it. And then you can go back and revisit those and change those with the vote of the board of directors. So it's not up to the executive director to say, I don't like this policy, I'm going to change it. It's up to the board. It's up to the executive director to say to the board of directors, maybe we could look at this policy because it's not working very well. We're not really in compliance with how we're doing this. So then it's the board's responsibility. All of that stuff engages you as a board member. And if you're an executive director, it keeps you, it covers your behind, and it also shows your willingness to participate and act in partnership with your board of directors. It's a two-way street. It's always a two-way street. So I've changed, going to page 4, I've already talked about that. Let's go to page 5, planning. So in planning, you have responsibilities in 4 areas. You review your mission, make sure your vision, your mission and your philosophy and your goals are in accord. You plan your future, 1 year, 3 years at the most. You determine the projects and the programs that you're going to take on. Well, I always like to make sure that, money comes and goes. So a grand opportunity comes along and you say, wow, we could get this money. And then we could hire a project person to take that project on, and it may or may not be in accordance with your purpose, but you want that money. You really could use a little money, and there is a little admin money that goes with that. So then it's up to the board of directors and working with the executive director to go back to your philosophy and say, are we going to do that? And maybe you're going to change some of the programs that you offer or some of the things that you do. But you don't want to change it just because this pot of money has come and then it's going to vanish. Then we're not going to do that anymore. I mean, how's the public going to know what you're doing? You're going to do one thing one year, you're going to do something else another year. You really want some consistency, some stability in your, and maybe you could even build a lot of credibility by going to another organization and saying, you know, I saw this grant proposal that would be fun for us to take it on, kind of what we do, but not exactly, but it's really more in your area. So an example would be that United Way got a bunch of bequests. We got a boat, we got a house, I mean, the big monies. So we sold those and we had this big pot of money, we didn't know what to do with it. So we started a foundation. And the higher ups, at that time was United Way of America, said, well, you're way too small to have a foundation. Your county's too little, you don't raise enough money. And we said, well, thank you for your opinion. And we went back to the board and said, well, what do you think? And they said, no, we can do it. And so now there is, you know, there's this organization called the Clown Community Foundation, which is within the United Way. So that was different than what we did. Well, but we wanted to make sure in doing this foundation that we made sure that the funding went to social and human services. Well, then we had people wanting to give us money to do scholarships because they liked United Way, they liked our board, they liked me, and then they felt confident and they had a lot of trust in us. So we want to give my money to you, my wife Diana put this funding here, but I want it to be scholarships for the West End, for students at the West End. And we said, you know, that's not what we do. So we went out to the West End School District and helped them get some little foundation going so that they could administer the money for their organization. And we gave some money to, directed money to, we directed some money to Peninsula Behavioral Health for somebody who wanted to set up a little fund for their chronically mentally ill son. We send money to the Education Foundation, the Port Angeles Education Foundation for scholarship. So you really want to look at all of that and make sure it's consistent with what you're doing. That's your role as a board member. That's your role. So turning the page, human resources, as I said, you have duties in this regard. You got board membership, which is really, really important. You hire the executive director. The executive director builds his or her staff. But they come to the board with, it's not really permission, it's an agreement, it's a partnership as to how do we need to expand staff. So you've got personnel policies. What about vacation? What about sick leave? What about retirement benefits? What about health insurance? All that kind of stuff. And then volunteer involvement. So what do you need? What's the board going to do with volunteer involvement? Well, you all have volunteers that are doing things in your community, and you want to make sure that there's policies around that, and particularly now with COVID, you want to have some COVID policies. Is it going to be mask only? We're only going to do events that are outside? Lots of things like that. So on board membership, I just want to say, there are some agencies where the executive director wants to fill the board. And that really is not right. It's not illegal, but it's not right. And it's not the responsibility. The board is abdicating their responsibility. It's the board's role to find board members, to cultivate board members, to look at your board membership to see where you've got holes, who can come in, how that's going to be. Is this a person who follows through? Is this a good worker? That's the board responsibility, and you want to set up a process for doing that. I personally think that the board nominations committee, or whatever you want, board development committee, is one of the most responsible, one of the most important committees on a board of directors, because they determine what that board is going to look like. And I will just reference this. It's sort of pertinent, but it's just my personal opinion. Look at our Supreme Court. So you can see how a Supreme Court has gone very conservative from having been very liberal, and is totally dependent on who's in power and who's in charge of that. So you want to make sure that you have on your board of directors that you have a balance of views. You don't want everybody you want people to be positive for your organization, but you don't necessarily want a lot of yes men. You know what I'm saying? You want people that are not afraid to speak up, who are not afraid to say, this is not maybe an issue, or let's look at this a different way. So human resources is a very important thing. Another thing about human resources is you know, the executive director hires the staff, but sometimes executive directors are there, maybe because of their lack of knowledge or whatever, not necessarily, they're not necessarily team players within their staff people. And so I've seen organizations almost fail because the staff is in such disarray, and there wasn't a way for them to get to the board, to talk to the board, because the pathway was only through the executive director, and the executive director and the board got along really well. So the board would say, well, I don't see what the problem is, and so things shut down. And I've seen 4 or 5 different agencies go through that cycle. And you want to make sure that you've got some pathways for staff members to talk to board members too. You want to have those things like whistleblowing policies and conflict of interest policies within your staff people. So organizational operations, turn the page. Pretty straightforward. That's a lot of what Jennifer talked about. So you really want to get that. There's another book that you can get. It's called the Revised Model Nonprofit Corporation Act. It's put out by the American Bar Association. And that was revised in 2021. And they recommend, so that whole revised model nonprofit corporation, that whole book was written by the Bar Association for a lot of managing your risk and how board member, all the stuff that Jennifer talked about. But it's directed to state legislators to change their own RCWs. So it's like a guideline for the state legislators. That makes sense. So I have referenced that book a lot, but I've never really sat down and read it. I looked it up last night to see what it costs. It's a little over $100. You can get a bar member association to buy it for you. I think it's $104. And they don't revise it very often. The last time it was revised was 1987, so it's good. Some people, like Jennifer, love that stuff. And you want to find out who those people are if you're not one of those people. So I try always to stay off of bylaws. That's not my favorite thing. I'm not a real detailed person. So I get more excited about the vision and the organization, what we're doing. But you have to pay attention to the details, and you have to have somebody who does pay attention to the details to keep you on track. Because one of the things that this revised code says, revised nonprofit blah blah, says is that the means do not justify the ends. Or the end does not justify the means, excuse me. So you can't say, because I'm really passionate about homelessness or food inequality, or I'm really passionate about that cause, that you could do whatever you want to reach that end, to fund that. And, you know, in my years with United Way and then staying on top of this, still staying involved with nonprofits, I've seen some pretty awful things where people ignore the path just to get to the end. And they do things that are maybe not ethically right, or there's conflicts of interest. But, you know, they probably have the same attitude that I had towards United Way of America. We were supposed to be answerable to United Way of America, and I go, we're Port Angeles, we're out here in Clallam County. Do I think that United Way of America cares about what I'm doing out here, or they're gonna send somebody? They're never gonna find out. So we just, you know, like starting our foundation, they said, no, we don't advise it. And I went, well, what the heck, we're gonna do it. And the board really wanted to do it, so we did it. So you really want to pretend that somebody is watching over you. So you've got the board watching over the organization and the executive, and you got to pretend that there's somebody watching over the board, and it's a state, and they're not going to come in and, you know, examine you all the time and stuff. But the reality is you have to pretend that they are going to, so that keep yourself honest. Financial management, financial stability. Financial management and financial stability are two different things. Financial management is managing the money that you have. Financial stability is making sure that there's more money coming in, that you know how your organization is going to stay stable. So you want to put money aside for reserve. If you're running on cash flow, you know, you're just spending the money that comes in the door, then you're very vulnerable to losing your organization. So you want to manage how that money goes. Kind of, for the United Way, we had to kind of think of ourselves as farmers, because at that time, we just raised money during the United Way campaign, and then that money had to last us all year. And when that money was allocated on April 1st, I would say, well, we're broke. We don't have any money. Now we have to start thinking about how we're going to raise for next year's campaign. So I never got to live in the present. I always had to live in the future. But that's a lot of what financial stability is about. You have to put in an amount for uncollectibles. You got to put in an amount that you want to save for buying capital equipment. Maybe, I mean, some of you are having building fundraisers, fund drive, capital campaigns. So all of that is financial stability, that's looking out ahead. Your financial management is make sure that you're paying the bills every month, that you have enough money coming in to fund your operation, that I remember one organization in town where they had a founder director, and then that director retired, and the organization wanted to continue, but she was running on cash flow, and there was no money to pay the new executive director. So that they didn't know that until they hired the new executive director, who knew more of this stuff, looked at the books, and went out and actually she went back to work at her old job. And then she said, I'll do executive director stuff half-time, on like a part-time job for no pay for almost a year. So you don't want to put your organization in that kind of a position.
So Patty, is there a best practice for amount of reserves that a nonprofit should have, 6 months or?
I think it's just the same as in a small business.
Yeah.
We always like to have 3 to 6 months operating reserve set aside.
Okay.
Now, there was one organization that United Way would not fund because they had like 2 years set aside and they wouldn't touch it. So it's like having the rainy day fund and it never rains, or they're in the desert. So that was too much of a reserve. We said, no, you really have to show your need. You have to spend your money down. But hopefully you're prudent householders as well, and you're not running your credit card up to the max and then paying the minimum amount every month, So you want to have that reserve, and you want to plan that in the beginning of the year, and you want to look at that reserve. So we work with Tim at the Friends of the Library, and he helps keep us make sure that we are not spending all of our endowment, so that there's money there still. And then we're able to supplement with the store money. So as a board member, there's a little thing that I handed out about rights and responsibilities of board members. So you want to make sure that you get a budget every month, you get, a financial statement every month, and that at least quarterly it's compared to a budget to see where you are. Now budgets, often will project that we're going to spend X amount of dollars every month and a certain amount of money is going to come in every month. And the reality is it's not always like that. The insurance is due quarterly, for example. The rent is due every month, or the mortgage is due every month, but other things might be less. Or you have a vehicle, so you're just going to pay the license once a year. So you have to be sure that when you're budgeting, you're planning for when the big expenditures are, as well as the regular monthly expenditures. So I hope that makes sense to you, that you do that. You want your board to be involved. If you're a fundraising organization, you want to make sure that your board members are all participating donors at the level that they can afford. I was asked to come on a board once, and I was told I had to give a minimum of $500. I went, well, I don't think I can afford that. I don't know that I want to do that. So I decided, and they said, well, you don't have to do it yourself. You could go out and raise it from other people, but that's your responsibility. And so some people did just write a check for $500, and other people went out and they raised it among their friends or their business acquaintances to get the $500. But that didn't feel quite right for me. So we put a policy in our United Way board that all of our board members would be donors at a level that felt comfortable with them. And we had student board members as well. So a student board member might only give $5. That was fine. It's to show your participation. when I went on to the Friends of the Library Board, I said, well, what about this? Board members donate. And they said, well, we're not really that kind of an organization. And so we threw that out. We didn't have to do that. So managing the risk. All right, so now I'm over here on page 11. So now we'll just talk a little bit, because it's after 10 o'clock, a little bit about what your risk is. So you want to identify what kinds of harm can come to you or to your volunteers, who could be injured, who is held responsible. Who is held responsible almost as always the board of directors. So you want to make sure that you're up to speed on these new RCWs about your responsibility, your acting in good faith, your duty of care, your duty of loyalty. When you vote on something as a board member, if you need to abstain, make sure it gets put in the minutes. If you vote no, make sure it gets put in the minutes. I've had people say on boards of directors that I've been on, I want to vote against this proposal, but I really don't want it recorded. And you would say, no, really, you want it recorded. And there's a time period where, and it can be a long time, I don't really think, it might be 10 years or something, where a decision that was made, that you're still responsible for that. And I know people that have been called back to another state to talk about a decision that was made that they just went along with, that they didn't feel was right, and they still bore responsibility for that. So as a board member, so I'm really talking about board members here. As a board member, you want to make sure that your vote is counted. So if it's 100% yes, and you're the secretary, you can just write 100%, pass unanimously. But if somebody abstains or somebody votes no, you want to make sure that Patty Hanna voted no, to know that that was down there. So if it's a decision that comes back to bite you, it could be, I mean, it's really hard to know when what those decisions are. But when they do, if they do come back, you want to make sure that you were clear on what it was. Could be somebody, you know, we're a pretty litigious country, right? Well, we have been for some time. And so people do sue about things that you might not think that they would sue about. Try to think right now of an example that would come to mind. I know one where, so say you're driving a car and you get in a car accident, and then somebody gets hurt, like a pedestrian or a passenger in the car. You could be sued. I mean, somebody could bring suit against you for that because maybe your insurance wasn't adequate. And when the board went to buy the insurance for the vehicles, they said, no, we're not going to do personal injury, it's too expensive. We're not going to do that. What's it called? Comprehensive something. So they said, no, we're not going to do that. We're just going to have collision because it's an old car. Well, then you as a board member could be responsible for that. So you really have to be careful about that. Or you're going to have somebody, speaking of like a vehicle, you're going to have somebody who's a friend work on the vehicle because it's not working right. And then people get in the car, your volunteer get into the vehicle, and it breaks down and leaves them stranded, or there's something goes wrong. So those kinds of things, you have to kind of think about the what ifs. And it doesn't mean to be negative all the time. You know, well, what if this happens and what if that happens? And you can't let it stop you from taking action. But you do have a responsibility to look at those things and weigh the risk versus the reward of that. Is it worth the $100 saved to have the friend work on the car? Might not be. So that's managing the risk. I want to go ahead to, you need to have, let's see, now I'm on page 14. You need to have these preparations. And so Jennifer went over a lot of that stuff. It's in the bylaws now, but it's also just good policy. You get your agenda and your minutes sent out ahead of time. I don't think it's fair to have the minutes read at a board meeting and have somebody, and then have the board approve them. They're not really looking at them to see if what was recorded was right. But you know, the minutes are that's your legal record. Those minutes are important. Are you going to make sure that they're recorded and stored someplace? Action items should be, you know, in the agenda, so when you go to a meeting, you know what to expect. You want to have open discussion, but you might want to put a time limit on it. You need to attend regularly. That's called non-management. If you don't come to board meetings and you're still on the board of directors and they make decisions that you don't agree with, you're still liable. And the insurance, the D&O insurance, isn't going to cover you because that's just called non-management. You should have a board manual. You should ideally get a little board orientation. It's about the organization, what they do. You make sure that your minutes are signed by the president and the person who takes them. You make sure that your legal requirements are met, like a conflict of interest policy, that board members are not being paid to come to board meetings. Corporate boards, that's a different story. But nonprofit boards, you don't get to get paid. There are cases where you can get compensation because you're providing a certain kind of service. But even then, if there's three, so say you're going to get stuff printed up and there's 3 printers in town, one printer is on your board, is it right that one printer would get all of your agency's work? Or should you go out and get bids and see what's in the best interest of the organization? And maybe that person came on your board because he thought you were going to be an easy client. You know, well, there's money in the pocket that I don't have to worry about. So you have to look at those kinds of things. Abstentions and dissenting votes are noted. What did I write down here? Board members contracting with organization. Oh, never mind, we talked about that. Then your legal obligations. Mismanagement, non-management, and self-dealing. Self-dealing is when you're making decisions that are going to benefit you. So that's where you want to be careful about that. And no D&O insurance is going to cover you. And no law is going to exonerate you from that. One of the things that I learned in my management classes that I took was that you can process before a decision or you can process after the decision is made. Boards are not efficient. I can tell you that. They take a long time. You have to be tolerant. You have to be patient. You have to be really patient with the man sitting alongside of you or the woman who wants to talk and talk and talk about stuff. Because if you cut them off and and then you just say, no, we just get to the decision, you're likely to go back and revisit that decision. So you want to make sure that you take enough time to do it. And if you have the majority of the board in agreement to say, okay, we've talked about this for 4 meetings now, and next month we are going to make our decisions. But they're not efficient. But I like that saying, process before or process after. And it's harder to process after because other people might be involved in that decision. And then you have to go back to those people and say, well, you know that decision we made, well, we're going to take that back. Well, we're really not going to do that anymore. And they were sort of counting on that. So one of the examples that happened with United Way, when I lost patients, and it was my own fault, I lost patients, was that we decided that we would have 3-year guarantees of funding for certain agencies. Sounded like a good idea. The board talked about it. We went to a conference. We listened to other agencies that did that. So after 3 years, then you were not going to be guaranteed any funding, and then you would sort of like reapply and do this all over again. So we voted for it. The board voted yes, let's do that. We notified the agencies, okay, we're going to have 3-year funding cycles now, and this. And then people went home, and they started thinking about it, and they came back to the next board meeting and said, we need to revisit this. So we revisited it for a couple more months. Then we had to go back to the agencies and say, you know what, that's not going to happen. We're not going to do 3-year funding. And some agencies were really happy because they didn't like that idea. But other agencies were kind of upset because they thought, oh, this is great. This is good. I don't need to worry about this. So process before, process after. Better to process before. Take your time. And then on page 15, we talk about the rights of board members. Perfect, to have opportunities for orientation, to carry out activities that are well planned. Think about yourself, excuse me, if you were a volunteer, what would you want to have? Will you want to go into the events? And if your job is to go to the event and set it up, great. So you understand that. You know where the tables are and the chairs and the banners and all that stuff. If your job is to come and staff the table, and you get there when the event opens or 5 minutes before, because you're just going to staff it, and nothing is set up because it hasn't been planned out, and you find yourself setting up the tables, scurrying around, where the heck are the chairs, all that stuff. You don't want to do that. So you have a right as a board member to expect that things are going to be well planned, organized, and taken care of, that you have a job assignment that fits you. And you might have to search around. If you're an executive director and you've got board members that don't seem to be doing very much, maybe you haven't found the right job for them. Maybe they're a project person and not a maintenance person. So they don't like the ongoing blah, blah, blah of the board meeting, but they really wanted to get in there and do a hands-on project. They want to look at your bylaws and revise them and feel like that's a job well done. So you want to talk with your board members, or as a board member, you want to be talked to by your executive director and find out what's going to be the best fit for you. And you might want to know that even before you agree to come onto the board. So it's pretty common sense stuff, you know, but I think it's stuff that we easily overlook in the day-to-day, just getting along. So building a strong board, talk about recruitment. You want to assess the current board. So even if your board is small, you want to make sure that it reflects the needs that your organization has. People always say, oh, I want to have a lawyer on my board. Oh, I want to have an accountant on my board. Because we're going to need these accountant abilities. But, you know, you can contract with those too. If you have a small board, you might not want to take up a board position with that. You might want to just have a contract relationship with somebody who volunteers to do it for free. United Way was a very small office, only two of us. So we had one person. So it wasn't me, it was Nola. She went to the mailbox, she picked up the mail, she brought it back to the office, she opened all the envelopes, she recorded all the checks, she made the deposit. You know, that's not a good system. Because if Nola had decided to set up a secret account somewhere, we would never have known. I wouldn't have known. She didn't. I mean, she was honest as the day is long. She never would do that kind of thing. But organizations do, and you well know. I mean, every one of you can list an organization that has had somebody do that. So you want to make sure in your board that you have policies and things in place that kind of stuff doesn't happen. So if you need some accounting skills, you maybe want to have somebody to volunteer to come and do part of that. So, oh, and she balanced the checkbook too. So we had, excuse me, a volunteer who came in, not on the board. She didn't want to do the board stuff, but she was a volunteer to come in and balance the checkbook and then monitor what was going into the bank account. So we weren't in that sort of tenuous position of having one person be responsible for all of that. So there's a process in here about a way to work a strong board. It's not the only way, but it can be one way where you get a list of potential board members and you actually talk to them and say, would you ever be interested in joining our board of directors? Do you have a care about this particular cause? We don't have an opening right now, but if you would be interested, could we call on you sometime? So it doesn't have to be, I go to you and I say, you're my best friend and I love being on this board and I know you're going to like it too. Why don't you come onto this board? It's not that kind of a process. It's more important than that. It's more thought out than that. So this is one way, but I'm sure you have a way. But I always believe in recruiting board members and potential board members all year long. So you always have people come and go, they move, they get sick, they lose interest, whatever. And they don't want to be on that board anymore. So you want to have people that you can go to that will kind of like fit a slot. So you could have a whole chart. You could do a whole Excel spreadsheet on these are the areas that we want to have covered. And then these are the areas, who do we know that can fill this? That also cares about our organization. So, you know, what happens in Clallam County? Oh, we don't have any Native Americans on our board. We need a Native American on our board just because they're Native American. You want to know, is that person interested in your organization? Is there a role for that person? They don't want to be the token a Native American on your board. In the cities, it might be the token Black person or the token Asian. Or people my age would be the token woman on the board. So you don't want to be that, you don't want to recruit somebody just for that reason. There has to be a broader reason than that. So I just leave you with all of that information. Build a strong board. Is there a little quiz on the end about who does what? Yeah, that's a fun thing to go through about who does the planning. It gives you an idea about all of the things that you're responsible for as a board member. You as executive directors, half of your job at least, should be working with the board of directors. Guiding, helping, supporting, not controlling, letting the board do its job in partnership with you as the executive director. Keeping the board engaged just to that right amount. Not so much that they get sick of you and sick of the organization, they say, never want to do that again, but the right amount where they're comfortable and you're comfortable and things get done and things move forward. So with that, I leave you with that. Thank you very much. It's always fun to come out. If you have questions, you can always contact me. And I don't have anything with my name on it or email. Yeah, find me. No, mphannah@olypen.com.
Does anyone? Thank you, Patty. Does anyone have any questions? We will make sure to include both Patty's and Jennifer's information in a post email to everyone so that you have all of that. And if you have any questions, you will have their contact information so that you can reach out to them privately. And once again, let's give both of our speakers today, Patty and Jennifer, a round of applause for taking time out of their busy schedules. And for you guys being present today. We're really happy that you guys could join. Is there something up there? What's it say? Oh,
Just
everyone's
clapping.
up saying thank you. I'm going to let our executive director give some final words and an adjournment to our meeting today. Thank you once again for joining us.
Thanks, Lori. So we have this room for a bit longer, right? We're here all day. We've got a North Olympic Legislative Alliance meeting from 1 to 4. Okay, and so if you want to stay a bit, that's fine. And we will send out the email with the slides and the documents that were here for everybody, and we will include a Word version of the EDC documents that Jennifer so graciously delved into for many, many, many hours. So it's especially if you have members, it's a good place to start, I think.
And the recording.
And the recording will be up on our website later today or tomorrow. Yeah, we've got to convert it to YouTube, etc. So with that, thank you everyone, and really appreciate your time and your involvement and the work you do for Collin County. It's so important. So thank you.